Pope Leo XIV had no idea that hidden cameras were capturing every moment of what would become the most extraordinary morning of his papacy, when a simple walk through the Vatican gardens would lead to a discovery that would shake the very foundations of the Church. What started as his desperate attempt to find a few minutes of genuine solitude would transform into something far more profound than he could have ever imagined. The early morning mist clung to the ancient stone pathways like whispered prayers, creating an ethereal veil between the earthly gardens and the heavens above. Pope Leo XIV moved slowly along the familiar route, his white cassock barely visible through the fog that seemed to embrace the Vatican's most secluded corners. At 73, his steps had grown more deliberate, but his eyes remained sharp, drinking in the peace that these stolen moments provided. He paused beside a centuries-old olive tree, its gnarled branches reaching skyward like arthritic fingers in supplication. The weight of his office pressed heavily on his shoulders most days, but here, in these precious minutes before dawn, he could simply be Lorenzo, the boy from Naples who had once dreamed of becoming a simple parish priest. His weathered hands traced the bark's rough texture, remembering how his grandmother used to say that olive trees held the memory of every prayer spoken beneath their shade. The distant murmur of Vatican life was already beginning to stir beyond the garden walls. Soon his secretary would come looking for him, clipboard in hand, ready to recite the day's endless obligations. The Swiss guard maintained their respectful distance, shadows among shadows, but he knew they watched. They always watched. Cardinal Terretti had insisted on it after the incident in St. Peter's Square last month, when an overzealous photographer had gotten too close. What Pope Leo didn't know was that their vigilance extended far beyond human eyes. Concealed within the ancient stonework and nestled among the rose bushes, nearly invisible cameras tracked his every movement, installed by the Vatican's security chief without his knowledge. The morning mist that provided him such comfort also provided perfect cover for surveillance he never suspected existed. He knelt beside a patch of white roses, their petals still heavy with dew, and began to pray, as he had every morning for the past 3 years since his election. But something felt different today. The gardens seemed to hold their breath as if waiting. In the distance, so faint he almost dismissed it as imagination, came a sound that would change everything, a soft, mournful whimper that seemed to call to something deep within his soul. The sound came again, clearer this time, a low, plaintive bark that seemed to drift through the morning mist like a ghost seeking solace. Pope Leo XIV lifted his head from his prayers, his keen eyes scanning the rose garden's shadowed corners. The white petals around him trembled slightly in the gentle breeze, as if they too had heard the mysterious call. He remained kneeling for a moment, listening intently. The Vatican gardens held many secrets, accumulated over centuries of papal contemplation, but animal sounds were rare here. The gardeners maintained strict protocols about wildlife, understanding that the Holy Father's morning prayers required absolute tranquility. Yet there it was again, unmistakably the cry of a dog in distress. Rising slowly, his joints protesting the morning dampness, Pope Leo moved deeper into the rose garden. The perfectly manicured paths gave way to wilder sections where ancient, climbing roses had been allowed to grow with abandon, creating natural alcoves of privacy. It was here, among these forgotten corners, that he felt most connected to the simple faith of his youth. "Your Holiness?" The voice of Captain Benedetti, his head of security, crackled softly through the hidden communicator worn by the nearest Swiss guard. Though the Pope couldn't see him, he could sense the man's growing unease at his deviation from the usual route. "Is everything as it should be?" The Pope raised his hand slightly, a gesture he knew would be relayed to halt any immediate intervention. These men were devoted to his safety, but sometimes their dedication threatened the very solitude he sought. He continued forward, guided by an instinct he couldn't quite name. The bark echoed again, more urgent now, seeming to emanate from somewhere beyond the formal garden boundaries. There, where the manicured lawns surrendered to the wilder growth, near the ancient Vatican walls, maintenance areas that few visitors ever glimpsed. Pope Leo had walked these gardens for 3 years, yet this sound drew him toward sections he'd never fully explored. A young gardener emerged from behind a towering hedge, startled to encounter the Pope in this remote corner. The man quickly removed his cap, bowing deeply, his weathered hands still clutching pruning shears. "Santo Padre, forgive me, I did not expect—" "Have you heard it too?" the Pope asked quietly, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had endeared him to millions. The crying, the gardener's eyes widened with recognition. "See, Your Holiness, for 2 days now. We thought perhaps a stray had wandered onto the grounds, but—" He gestured helplessly toward the thick vegetation ahead. "The sound, it seems. To move." Pope Leo nodded, understanding flooding through him. Something was calling to him from the hidden depths of God's garden, and every instinct told him he must respond. The Pope moved past the bewildered gardener, following a narrow maintenance path that wound between towering cypress trees and overgrown hedgerows. Here, the Vatican's manicured perfection gave way to practical necessity. Storage sheds, compost areas, and equipment housing that served the gardens but remained hidden from public view. The morning mist grew thicker in these confined spaces, muffling sound and creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. Another bark echoed through the air, closer now and distinctly more urgent. Pope Leo paused, tilting his head to better locate its source. The sound seemed to emanate from somewhere ahead, beyond a chain-link fence that marked the boundary between the gardens and the Vatican's utility areas, territory he had never entered during his papacy. "Santo Padre," Captain Benedetti's voice, carried across the garden, no longer filtered through radio communication, but spoken aloud from perhaps 30 meters behind. "With respect, this area requires special clearance." The Pope didn't turn around. Something in that distant cry spoke to a deeper part of his soul, the same instinct that had guided him through 40 years of ministry in Naples' most troubled neighborhoods. He had learned to trust these promptings, even when they led him into uncomfortable territory. "Captain," he called back softly, his voice carrying the gentle firmness that few at the Vatican dared to challenge. "I believe our Lord is calling me forward. Surely he has clearance in his own house." The maintenance path curved sharply to the left, leading toward a cluster of weathered buildings that housed groundskeeping equipment. The barking grew more persistent, accompanied now by what sounded like scratching, desperate rhythmic sounds that spoke of an animal in genuine distress. Pope Leo approached the fence, noting the small gap where the chain link had been pulled, away from its post, creating an opening just large enough for a determined person to squeeze through. The metal edges were smooth, worn by time rather than force, suggesting this breach had existed for some time without detection. Behind him, he could hear the measured footsteps of his security detail, drawing closer but maintaining their respectful distance. He knew they were radioing ahead, alerting the utility area guards, setting protocols in motion that would soon surround him with well-meaning protection. But for now, in this suspended moment between decision and action, he remained free to follow his conscience. The barking came again, and with it something else, a sound that made his breath catch. Beneath the animal's distress, he heard what could only be described as recognition, as if the creature knew he was approaching and was calling specifically to him. Without hesitation, Pope Leo XIV stepped through the gap in the fence, leaving the security of his garden sanctuary behind. Beyond the fence, the Vatican's hidden infrastructure sprawled before him, a maze of service roads, storage facilities, and maintenance buildings that kept the Holy City functioning. Pope Leo followed the increasingly urgent barking toward a weathered shed nearly consumed by untrimmed hedgerows. The structure seemed forgotten, its green paint peeling like aged parchment, ivy cascading over its corrugated roof. The sound led him around the building's corner, where broken concrete gave way to a small clearing, choked with weeds. There, partially hidden beneath the shed's raised foundation, lay a magnificent German shepherd. Even in distress, the animal's noble bearing was unmistakable. Its thick coat a rich mixture of black and tan, its intelligent eyes alert despite obvious pain. Pope Leo's breath caught as he took in the full scene. The dog's left hind leg was clearly injured, possibly broken, and dried blood matted the fur along its flank. Yet as their eyes met, the animal's tail began a tentative wag, and it attempted to rise before collapsing back with a soft whimper. "Santo Dio," the Pope whispered, immediately dropping to his knees despite the rough ground. All thoughts of protocol and procedure evaporated in the face of this creature's suffering. He extended his hand slowly, allowing the dog to catch his scent. "Your Holiness." A maintenance worker emerged from behind the shed, his coveralls stained with grease, his face a mixture of shock and panic. "I didn't know you were, that is, this area is not—" "How long has he been here?" Pope Leo asked quietly, not taking his eyes from the injured animal. 2 days, perhaps 3. "We've been trying to contact animal control, but with the weekend and the bureaucracy—" The man's voice trailed off, as he realized he was making excuses to the Vicar of Christ. The German shepherd stretched his muzzle toward the Pope's outstretched fingers, the gesture so trusting it brought tears to the pontiff's eyes. As their skin made contact, the dog's entire demeanor shifted. The anxious panting subsided, replaced by what could only be described as profound relief. "We need a veterinarian," Pope Leo said, his voice carrying absolute authority despite its gentle tone. "Immediately." "But Holy Father, the protocols—" "This is my protocol," the Pope interrupted, carefully stroking the dog's noble head. The animal pressed closer, as if recognizing sanctuary in this unlikely place. "Whatever bureaucracy stands between this creature and healing, remove it." As the Pope knelt in the dirt beside the wounded shepherd, he had no idea that hidden cameras had captured every moment of what would soon be called a miracle. Something profound was beginning, something that would transform not just one injured animal, but the very heart of the Church itself. As Pope Leo continued to gently stroke the German shepherd's head, something extraordinary began to unfold. The injured animal, which moments before had been trembling with pain and exhaustion, suddenly grew completely still. Not the stillness of fear or shock, but something deeper, a profound quietude that seemed to emanate from the very core of its being. The dog's dark eyes, previously clouded with distress, became startlingly clear and focused entirely on the Pope's face. It was as if the animal was seeing not just a man in white robes, but something else entirely, something it recognized. "Incredible," the maintenance worker whispered from behind them. "He's been so agitated, wouldn't let anyone near. We thought he might be rabid the way he was carrying on." But Pope Leo barely heard the words. He was transfixed by what was happening before him. The German shepherd, slowly, carefully, despite its obvious injuries, began to shift its position. With tremendous effort, the animal managed to place its massive head directly into the Pope's open palm, then closed its eyes in what could only be described as reverence. The morning mist seemed to swirl around them, creating an ethereal bubble of silence in the midst of the Vatican's awakening bustle. Even the distant sounds of approaching security seemed muffled, as if the world itself was holding its breath to witness this moment. Then, something even more remarkable occurred. The dog began to emit a low, rhythmic sound, not a whimper or growl, but something that resembled a hum, almost musical in its quality. The vibration traveled through the Pope's palm and up his arm, filling him with an inexplicable sense of peace and recognition. "Your Holiness," Captain Benedetti's voice carried across the clearing as the security team finally located them. "We need to get you away from that animal immediately. It could be dangerous." Pope Leo looked up, his face radiant with an expression his guards had never seen before, a mixture of wonder and certainty that seemed to transform his entire countenance. "Captain," he said softly, never removing his hand from the dog's head, "I don't believe danger is what we're dealing with here." The German Shepherd opened its eyes again, and this time, impossibly, it seemed to nod, a deliberate, conscious gesture of acknowledgement, as if it were saying, "Yes, you understand. You're the one I've been waiting for." In that moment, Pope Leo Utrey realized that his morning prayer walk had led him not to a simple rescue, but to an encounter that defied all rational explanation. This magnificent creature somehow knew him, recognized him, and had been calling to him specifically across the vast expanse of the Vatican gardens. The question that would haunt him for the rest of this extraordinary day was simple. How? 3 levels beneath St. Peter's Basilica, in a room that officially didn't exist on any Vatican blueprint, Security Chief Colonel Marco Santini stared at 17 high-definition monitors displaying feeds from cameras that Pope Leo XIV had never been told about. His weathered hands gripped the edge of the control desk as he watched the impossible scene unfold in real time on screen 7. "Madonna Santa," whispered Father Giuseppe Torretti, the Vatican's Director of Communications, leaning over Santini's shoulder. "Tell me those cameras aren't recording." Santini's jaw tightened. "Everything is always recording, Father. That's the point." On the screen, they watched their Holy Father kneeling in the dirt beside the German Shepherd, his white cassock already stained with mud and what appeared to be blood from the animal's wounds. But it wasn't the Pope's disregard for protocol that had both men transfixed. It was the dog's behavior. Even through the grainy surveillance footage, the animal's transformation was undeniable. Cardinal Alessandro Torretti, the Pope's Secretary of State, entered the security chamber without knocking, a privilege of his rank and his growing concern about this morning's events. His usually composed demeanor cracked as he took in the multiple screens showing various angles of the encounter. "How long has this surveillance been in place?" the Cardinal asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Since the incident in St. Peter's Square," Santini replied, not taking his eyes from the monitors. "His Holiness doesn't know. We felt it was necessary for his protection." Father Giuseppe paused the footage at the moment when the dog seemed to nod at the Pope, a gesture so deliberate it sent chills through all 3 men. "This cannot be released. The implications of what?" Cardinal Torretti demanded. "That our Holy Father shows compassion to an injured animal, that he follows Christ's example of healing." "No," Santini said quietly, rewinding the footage to show the dog's initial reaction to the Pope's presence. "The implications of this," he pointed to the screen as the German Shepherd's entire demeanor shifted from agitation to what could only be described as recognition. "Animals don't behave this way, not without reason." The 3 men watched in silence as the Pope's hand made contact with the dog's head, and the animal's mysterious humming began. Even through the security system's audio, the sound was hauntingly beautiful, unlike anything any of them had heard before. "There's something else," Santini said reluctantly, switching to a wider-angle camera. "The thermal imaging shows temperature fluctuations around both the Pope and the animal during their contact. Fluctuations that shouldn't be possible." "Cardinal." Torretti leaned closer to the screen, his face pale. "What are you suggesting, Colonel?" "I'm not suggesting anything, Your Eminence. I'm simply reporting what the equipment recorded." Santini's voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he reached for the phone. "But I think we need to call in some very discreet experts." Dr. Maria Castellano had delivered 3 papal speeches in her 20 years as the Vatican's chief physician, but she had never expected to treat a German Shepherd in the Pope's private study. The room, normally reserved for diplomatic meetings and theological contemplation, had been hastily converted into a makeshift veterinary clinic, complete with portable X-ray equipment and surgical supplies. "The fracture is clean," she reported, carefully wrapping the dog's hind leg. 3 weeks of rest, proper nutrition, and he should recover completely. She paused, studying the animal's remarkably calm demeanor. "Though I must say, I've never seen a patient so cooperative during treatment." Pope Leo XIV sat beside the makeshift examination table, his hand resting gently on the German Shepherd's head. Throughout the hour-long medical procedure, the dog had remained completely still, its dark eyes fixed on the Pope's face as if drawing strength from his presence. Cardinal Torretti stood near the window, his expression troubled. "Your Holiness, perhaps now that the animal has received proper care, we should arrange for its transfer to an appropriate facility." "No." The Pope's response was immediate and firm. "He stays here until he's fully healed." Dr. Castellano exchanged glances with the Cardinal. In all her years of service, she had never seen His Holiness so protective of anything, let alone a stray animal. But it was more than protectiveness. There was something almost reverential in the way the Pope regarded this particular creature. As if sensing their discussion, the German Shepherd slowly turned its massive head toward Cardinal Torretti, studying him with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Then deliberately, it looked toward the door leading to the Vatican's ancient corridors, its ears perking up with sudden interest. "What is it, my friend?" Pope Leo asked softly, following the dog's gaze. The animal's response was extraordinary. It carefully maneuvered itself to a standing position, despite its bandaged leg, balanced precariously for a moment, then took 3 deliberate steps toward the door. There it stopped, turned back to the Pope, and emitted that same mysterious humming sound they had heard in the maintenance area. "Santo Padre," Dr. Castellano whispered, "animals recovering from trauma don't typically display this level of purposefulness." The German Shepherd returned to the Pope's side, but continued to glance toward the door, its tail wagging with increasing urgency. It was as if the medical treatment had been merely a necessary delay, and now that it was healed enough to move, some greater mission was calling to it. Pope Leo XIV found himself faced with an impossible realization. This magnificent creature hadn't simply needed rescue. It had been waiting for him to find it, and now that it had his attention, it was trying to lead him somewhere specific. The question was no longer whether he would follow, but whether he was brave enough to discover where this mysterious messenger intended to guide him. Against all medical advice and Cardinal Torretti's increasingly urgent protests, Pope Leo XIV found himself following the German Shepherd through the Vatican's labyrinthine corridors. The dog moved with surprising grace despite its bandaged leg, pausing every few steps to ensure the Pope was still behind him, then continuing with unmistakable purpose toward destinations unknown. The ancient marble floors echoed with the soft click of the animal's claws and the whisper of the Pope's white cassock. Swiss guards stationed at various intersections stepped aside in confusion, unsure whether to salute their Holy Father or question why he was being led through the apostolic palace by an injured dog. "Your Holiness," Cardinal Torretti pleaded, struggling to keep pace, "this is highly irregular. You have audiences scheduled. The consistory meeting." "The consistory can wait," Pope Leo replied gently, his eyes never leaving the German Shepherd. "Something tells me this is more important than any meeting I could attend." The dog led them past the papal library, through corridors lined with Renaissance frescoes that had witnessed centuries of papal processions. Monsignor Benedetti, The Aedus, Vatican's master of ceremonies, pressed himself against the wall as the unusual parade passed, his mouth agape at the sight of the Vicar of Christ following an animal through hallways where emperors and saints had once walked. As they approached the area near the Sistine Chapel, the dog's behavior grew more urgent. Its tail wagged with increasing intensity, and it began emitting soft whimpers that seemed to express both excitement and frustration. Whatever it was seeking, they were drawing close. "Santo Padre," whispered Father Martinez, the chapel's sacristan, emerging from a side corridor with an armload of liturgical vestments. "Is everything, that is, do you require assistance?" The German shepherd suddenly stopped before an unremarkable stone archway that led to a maintenance corridor behind the chapel, an area rarely visited except by cleaning staff and restoration workers. The animal looked up at Pope Leo with those impossibly intelligent eyes, then back at the archway, its message clear: this way. Pope Leo hesitated for the first time since this extraordinary journey began. The corridor beyond the archway was narrow, dimly lit, and led into the Vatican's oldest sections where even he rarely ventured. Yet the dog's insistence was unmistakable, its entire body trembling with anticipation. "My friend," the Pope said softly, kneeling beside the magnificent creature, "are you certain this is where we need to go?" The German shepherd responded by gently grasping the hem of the Pope's cassock in its teeth and tugging him toward the archway. In that moment, Pope Leo XIV understood that he had reached a crossroads. He could return to the safety of his scheduled day, or he could trust this mysterious messenger and follow it into the unknown depths of the Vatican's ancient heart. The choice, he realized, had already been made the moment he first heard that distant bark in the garden. The maintenance corridor stretched before them like a tunnel through time itself, its rough stone walls bearing the marks of centuries. Dim electric bulbs, hastily installed decades ago, cast wavering shadows that danced across medieval masonry untouched by restoration. Pope Leo XIV had to duck slightly as they progressed deeper into the Vatican's forgotten bowels, the German shepherd limping determinedly ahead. The air grew cooler and carried the musty scent of ancient mortar and secrets long buried. Cardinal Toretti followed reluctantly, his breathing labored in the confined space, while a single Swiss guard brought up the rear, his hand resting uneasily on his radio. Suddenly, the dog stopped before what appeared to be a solid stone wall. But as Pope Leo drew closer, he could see faint lines in the masonry, the outline of a doorway that had been sealed so expertly it was nearly invisible. The German shepherd pressed its nose against a particular stone, whimpering softly, then looked back at the Pope with unmistakable urgency. "Impossible," Cardinal Toretti breathed, running his fingers along the sealed edges. "I've studied these blueprints for 20 years. There's nothing here." Pope Leo knelt beside the dog, examining the ancient stonework. Perhaps that was the intention. His fingers traced symbols carved so faintly into the stone they were barely perceptible, a papal seal he didn't recognize, worn nearly smooth by time. "We need Professor Agnetti," the cardinal said suddenly. "If there's a hidden chamber here, she's the only one who might understand its significance." Within the hour, Dr. Elena Agnetti, the Vatican's chief archivist, arrived with portable lighting, equipment and historical records dating back to the 15th century. Her eyes widened as she examined the sealed doorway, her trained fingers reading the stone like a manuscript. "This is extraordinary," she whispered, consulting a leather-bound tome. "This seal, it belongs to Pope Pius XX, but the construction technique is much older, Renaissance, possibly earlier." She looked up at Pope Leo with growing excitement. "Your Holiness, I believe this chamber was sealed during World War II." The German shepherd, as if understanding the importance of this revelation, placed its paw against the sealed door and emitted that haunting humming sound. The vibration seemed to travel through the ancient stone, and for a moment, everyone present could have sworn they heard something respond from the other side. A whisper of air, a settling of dust, as if the chamber beyond was awakening after decades of slumber. "Whatever lies behind this door," Dr. Agnetti said solemnly, "it was hidden for a reason. The question is whether that reason still exists." Pope Leo XIV placed his hand next to the dog's paw on the sealed stone, feeling the weight of history pressing against his palm. Somewhere beyond this wall lay answers to questions he hadn't even known to ask. The ancient mortar crumbled away like prayers whispered to dust as Vatican stoneworkers carefully removed the sealed stones. Pope Leo XIV watched each block emerge, his heart pounding with an anticipation he couldn't name. The German shepherd sat beside him, unnaturally still, as if it too understood the gravity of what was about to be revealed. When the final stone was lifted away, a wave of stale air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of old parchment and something else, something that made Dr. Agnetti gasp in recognition. "Myrrh," she whispered. "They used myrrh to preserve documents of the highest importance." Pope Leo stepped through the threshold, first, followed by the dog, whose tail had begun wagging with quiet satisfaction. Portable lights illuminated a small chamber, perhaps 10 feet square, its walls lined with wooden shelves that held dozens of metal document cases bearing the papal seal of Pius XIV. But it was the center of the room that stole their breath. There, on a simple wooden table, lay a leather-bound journal alongside a formal papal decree, both preserved in pristine condition. Cardinal Toretti approached the table with trembling hands, his voice barely a whisper as he read the Latin inscription. On the journal's cover, "The Secret Acts of Pope Pius X, for the eyes of future shepherds only." Dr. Agnetti carefully opened the journal to its first page, where Pius V's distinctive handwriting remained clear and bold despite the decades. "It's a record," she said, her voice filled with awe. "A complete record of the Vatican's underground network during the war, the Jewish families hidden in Vatican buildings, the false papers issued, the gold smuggled to resistance fighters." Pope Leo XIV felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders like a mantle. For decades, historians had debated Pius X's actions during World War II, some claiming he hadn't done enough to oppose the Nazi regime. But here, in this hidden chamber, lay proof of a massive covert operation that had saved thousands of lives. "There's more," Cardinal Toretti said, his voice thick with emotion. He held up documents that bore both papal and Nazi seals, forged transit papers that had allowed entire families to escape persecution, authorization letters for Vatican properties to serve as safe houses, detailed maps showing escape routes through the Vatican's own underground passages. The German shepherd moved to a corner of the chamber where a small plaque had been mounted on the wall. Pope Leo followed, reading the inscription aloud. "In memory of Max, faithful guardian, who gave his life protecting these sacred truths. May future shepherds find what he helped to hide." As the words left his lips, Pope Leo XIV understood everything. The dog beside him, this magnificent German shepherd who had led him through the Vatican with such purpose, somehow carried the spirit or memory of the original guardian, the one who had helped Pius XV hide these precious documents. The question that remained was simple yet profound. Why had this secret chosen now, and him, to finally come to light? Dr. Agnetti's hands trembled as she carefully turned the pages of Pius XV's journal, each entry revealing another piece of the extraordinary wartime puzzle. But it was a photograph tucked between the final pages that stopped her cold. The black and white image showed a young Vatican guard standing beside a magnificent German shepherd, both positioned in front of the very chamber where they now stood. "Santo Dio," she whispered, holding the photograph up to the light. "Look at this." Pope Leo XIV took the picture, studying the faces captured in that long-ago moment. The guard was perhaps 25, his uniform bearing the insignia of the Vatican's wartime security force. But it was the dog that made his breath catch, the same noble bearing, the same intelligent eyes, the same distinctive markings as the animal sitting beside him now. "It's impossible," Cardinal Terretti murmured, glancing between the photograph and the German shepherd. "This picture is from 1943. No dog lives 80 years. But Pope Leo was reading the handwritten note on the photograph's back, penned in pious, Uditi's careful script. Max and his handler, Giuseppe Benedetti, guardians of God's truth. May their sacrifice never be forgotten. The German shepherd approached Pope Leo and gently placed its paw on the photograph, that haunting humming sound rising from deep within its chest. This time, however, the sound carried something different, not urgency or guidance, but profound sadness mixed with completion. Dr. Agnetti continued reading from the journal's final entries. "Here," she said, her voice barely audible, "Pius XIV writes about the final days before the Allies liberated Rome. Giuseppe and his faithful Max sealed the chamber tonight, carrying with them the weight of thousands of lives saved. They know the Nazis grow suspicious. Max seemed to understand this might be their last act of service. As I blessed them both, I prayed that someday, when the time was right, these truths would find their way back to the light." Pope Leo XIV knelt beside the German shepherd, studying its eyes with new understanding. "You're not just any dog, are you? You're Max, or somehow you carry his spirit, his mission." He stroked the animal's head gently. "You've been waiting all these decades for the right moment to reveal what you helped hide." The dog's response was immediate and profound. It walked to the center of the chamber, sat perfectly still, and began that mysterious humming again. But now Pope Leo recognized it for what it truly was, not just sound, but song. A hymn of completion, of duty fulfilled, of love transcending even death. In that sacred moment, surrounded by documents that proved the Vatican's heroic wartime resistance, Pope Leo XIV realized he was witnessing something beyond human understanding. The Guardian had returned to ensure his sacrifice would finally be known, and the truth he died protecting would illuminate the world. The question now was how to honor such extraordinary faithfulness. 3 weeks later, St. Peter's Square overflowed with humanity as Pope Leo XIV prepared to address the world. Media crews from every continent had descended upon the Vatican, their cameras trained on the simple podium where the most extraordinary story of the century was about to be told. But it wasn't the press conference that had captured global attention. It was the footage that had mysteriously appeared on social media platforms worldwide, showing every moment of the Pope's journey with his mysterious canine guide. The German shepherd sat calmly beside the papal chair, his leg fully healed, his bearing as noble as ever. In the 3 weeks since the discovery, he had become the most famous dog in the world, though he seemed completely unaware of his celebrity status. His focus remained entirely on Pope Leo XIII, as if his mission was not yet complete. "My dear brothers and sisters," Pope Leo began, his voice carrying across the square and into homes around the globe. "3 weeks ago, I thought I was simply taking a morning walk. I had no idea that God was calling me to follow one of his most faithful messengers into the depths of our own history." The crowd fell silent as the Pope recounted the story, the mysterious barking, the injured dog, the incredible journey through the Vatican's hidden passages, and finally, the discovery that had shaken the Catholic Church to its foundations. Behind him, massive screens displayed images of the wartime documents, the photographs of the original Max and Giuseppe, and the hidden chamber that had preserved one of history's greatest untold heroic acts. The documents we discovered, Pope, Leo continued, prove beyond any doubt that Pope Pius V and countless brave souls within the Vatican conducted one of the most successful rescue operations in human history. More than 8,000 Jewish families found sanctuary within these walls. Hundreds of resistance fighters received support. Children who would have perished found new lives. As he spoke, the German shepherd slowly rose and walked to the podium. The crowd gasped as the animal placed his paw on the Pope's hand, the same gesture that had become iconic in the leaked footage. But this time, something different happened. The dog's humming began again, but now it was joined by thousands of voices in the square, people who had somehow learned to harmonize with that mysterious sound. The hymn rose from St. Peter's Square and seemed to encompass the entire world, a song of gratitude for sacrifice, of remembrance for the fallen, and of hope for the future. When the singing faded, the German shepherd looked once more into Pope. Leo's eyes touched his nose gently to the Pope's hand, and then, with profound dignity, walked slowly toward the edge of the square. At the steps leading away from the basilica, he turned back once, tail wagging in what could only be farewell. Then, as mysteriously as he had appeared, Max, guardian, guide, and messenger, disappeared into the Roman morning, his mission finally complete.